Everybody, welcome back to Making the Game from Concept to Kickstarter. I am your host Reece, and in this podcast we discuss the process of going from tabletop gaming idea to crowdfunding, production, fulfillment, and beyond. We use the example of our game Blood Throne, a Tower of Sacrifice, to illustrate the points. And if you are interested, you can still back that game in the Pledge Manager. It's going to be open for a little while longer over at GameFound. Just look up Blood Throne, the Tower of Sacrifice. This week, we're going to do another in our series of in-depth podcasts. This time, we're going to be talking about the Dread Mage. We were going to talk about the Rogue, which is a martial class, and to finish up all the four martial classes in the core box. But Andre M. over on GameFound asked if we could go into an arcane class instead. He wanted to see one of the wizards. So, happy to oblige. I decided to jump into the most unique class in Blood Throne, which is the Dread Mage. So the Dread Mage is easily the least familiar of the 12 classes in the core box. In the core box, we wanted to stick to really familiar fantasy archetypes to make it as easy to jump into a game that is complex like Blood Throne as possible. So, we have fighter, barbarian, things that are really easy to pick up and understand if you're familiar with RPGs at all. So the Dread Mage started out as a necromancer. Much like the Ranger, though, the Ranger started out with a pet. The necromancer was going to summon skeletons and things of this nature. But due to budgetary restraints, space limitations in the box, we had to cut down on the amount of classes that would summon. And much like the Ranger, I believe it ended up being a blessing in disguise because we ended up with something that was a little bit more unique. And but we will have a necromancer. Eventually, it's too cool of a class not to do. It just didn't make sense for the core box. And what we ended up with was a class that is somewhat similar, but instead of summoning, they have crowd control magic, right? Crowd control magic, for those who aren't familiar, or crowd control abilities, for those who aren't familiar in gaming term, they're abilities that can stun, control, move. Basically, you get your opponents or the monsters in PvE to do what you want them to do, not what they want to do. So it doesn't necessarily do a lot of damage, but it can be extremely, extremely powerful if you know what you're doing. So thematically, the Dread Mage ended up being a mage that uses the power of the void to control their opponents through fear, and then also to drain their life essence away. They can give it to themselves, they can give it to their allies. So it ended up being a really unique and really cool class. It kind of really took on a life of its own as we went through the playtesting process. And what you end up with is a class that at first glance you may not immediately understand what it does, but it can be relatively tanky. It's like a secondary healer, can do ranged damage, and obviously crowd controlling. So it's a very, very versatile class. It's easily the highest skill cap class, and I'll go through why on this. So it can be a little bit of an intimidating class for a new player to pick up because you really have to take the time to read all their skills and understand what they do. It's kind of like playing a wizard in an RPG, generally speaking. You need to be pretty familiar with their spells in order to get the most mileage out of them, or you can just cast Fireball, I guess. But the Dread Mage is a class that rewards someone who takes the time to understand what they do. And it can go from being somewhat daunting to the most versatile and the class that allows for the most creativity, because there's so many different ways to use the abilities that they have. And I'll get into that as we go. So this episode is going to be a little bit longer than the other in-depth series, and that's just because we're going to be introducing the arcane archetype classes. Arcane classes are like wizards. They use spells. They have lower physical stats, higher metaphysical stats. And whereas martial characters, which is what we started with because they're the easiest to explain, martial characters are characters that fight physically, like they shoot you with a bow if they're a ranger, they punch you, whatever the case may be. Arcane classes have some different mechanics, so I'll take the time to explain those so they make sense. But we'll start with equipment restrictions. So all arcane classes have they have more equipment restrictions than any other archetype of class. Right, so whereas skill classes are kind of in between arcane and martial, martial has the most freedom to choose their equipment, which makes sense. They use equipment. That's what they do. Arcane classes have the most restrictions because the emphasis is on their spellcasting ability. and not so much on giving him, Flaming Bastard Sword of +2 or whatever the case may be. Also, in a game like Bloodthrone, where it's a party-based game and you're going to be using multiple heroes at a time, usually, it's really important, especially in a PvP setting, that you can look at your opponent's models and have a pretty good idea of what you're looking at. So, like the example I've used before, if you put a model down that's wearing plate mail with a shield and like a sword, your opponent's going to naturally assume that's like some sort of a warrior or a fighter, and you're like, oh no, that's my wizard. It's going to be really confusing. So we put some restrictions on it just so that it would make it easier to visually identify them. Now, of course, there is exceptions when we get to the shaman, particularly, or the priest. The priest can take medium armor and a light shield, and they can take like a mace. And that's so if you want to make a priest that's like a D&D style classic cleric archetype, you can do that. But generally speaking, for the most part, your wizards are going to look like wizards, and that's just for the sake of making the game flow more smoothly. Now, it's not all negativity and restrictions. Arcane classes do have some unique equipment that only they can take, and I'll cover that really quickly. So they can take Arcane Staff. An Arcane Staff is like a quarterstaff, but it does quite a bit less damage, whereas a quarterstaff is a higher damage. The Arcane Staff, lower damage, still has reach, and reach again lets you go one more square orthogonally. Orthogonally is basically like on the cross. But that's not, you're usually not building a wizard to try and go and smack people with a stick. You could, though, if you wanted to, and that could be fun. It could be like Kung Fu Wizard. But primarily the reason you take it is that it has a keyword called Totem that gives you +1 to your Metaphysics ability. Metaphysics is the offensive modifier stat you use to cast spells. Right, now, some arcane classes aren't casting spells on the enemy, they're casting spells on their friends. So they don't need their stat to be that high, because when you cast a spell on an ally, it's if you hold still, it's a guaranteed success. But when you're casting spells on your opponent and you have to go against one of their defensive stats, which the Dread Mage is an offensive wizard, you want your metaphysics to be high to have a higher chance of success. So you take the Arcane Staff. It looks cool. Your wizard has a staff. It's very archetypal, but it gives you there's a reason to do it, right? Like I remember in D&D, especially in old editions, you never gave your wizard a staff because it was dumb from a stats perspective. They always had like a sling or a crossbow, which there's nothing wrong with that, but I always was kind of like, it's kind of dumb, So we wanted to give you a reason to feel smart for taking a staff on your wizard. We didn't want anybody to feel stupid. So it gives you reach, which is great, and it gives you +1 to your metaphysics. And I'll get into it. I don't want to overwhelm you with information here, but you can upgrade your equipment when you build the blacksmith in your camp. And there's some really cool upgrades for the staff. So I'll leave it at that. Next, there's the wand. The wand is a really cool ranged weapon. Anybody seen Harry Potter or any other, kind of classic depiction of a wizard? That's always magic users, witches, etc. A wand is really pretty common. So the reason that we put it into Bloodthrone is it does raw damage. It does two raw damage, which isn't a ton. It's not bad at all. But the reason why is because mechanically, you typically add your power to your damage, and a lot of wizards don't really put any points in that power. So we wanted like a universal range weapon that our arcane class could use, and that would bypass armor and shield, so it reliably will do damage. The other cool thing is that wands use metaphysics instead of accuracy for their modifier. Normally, when you use any type of physical weapon, you're going to use accuracy. Wand uses metaphysics, which the wizard's usually going to have high metaphysics anyway. So it gives you like a little pew-pew stick for a wizard when you build one that's going to be in the back. You can plink away. If you don't have a good spell to use at that particular circumstance, you can just shoot them with a wand. And then there's actually a dual wand. It counts as a two-handed weapon, but basically you can build like a gunslinger wizard that is shooting a double wand. It doesn't let you shoot two targets. We found that was too powerful. It's basically a more powerful version of the wand. It counts as a two-handed weapon, but it's cool, fun. It's maybe not something to build a arcane class around, but something fun that only wizards get. Lastly, there's the arcane focus. This is what we call a stat stick in video game terms. Basically, it eats one of your hand slots, and it gives you +1 to metaphysics. So you can't take it with the arcane staff. Just throwing it out there. In playtesting, you could get a stat that was so high it was ridiculous. But what you can do is you can take an arcane focus with, you know, a light hand weapon or a wand or something like that, and it doesn't take up very much encumbrance. Arcane classes have a very low encumbrance stat usually, which also helps eliminate coming up with really, really weird combos unless you build specifically to do it. So those are some of the cool equipment options that arcane classes have that only they have. And Tatiana, the Dread Mage that comes in the core box, she has an arcane staff, just to put some context on it. So another mechanic that I want to take the time to mention is called mobile casting. So in Bloodthrone, all heroes have 2 standard actions, 1 simple action. Standard actions are like move, cast a spell, attack, things of that nature. A simple action is they're very limited, and they're like, you know, drink a potion, you know, things of this nature. They're not, you know, attacking typically, casting a spell, etc. So there are what's also called compound actions. Compound actions combine 2 standard actions into 1. So it's like charging is the most common example where you move and then you make a melee attack. And we did this so that the game would move quickly and be very mobile. We wanted the game to feel like you could get all over the board and, you know, heroes and monsters are flying around. It was very dynamic. So one of the things we added into the game was called mobile casting, which, like charging, is a move plus casting a spell. Now, whereas charging, you get a bonus to do it because we want to incentivize being aggressive and not turtling. Mobile casting is the opposite. You get a penalty. You have an increased chance of failing your spell. So what we found in playtesting is that before we had mobile casting, wizards would stand still and cast spells, but then everything would go away from them. And then you were in the back, and then you would spend a turn just running to catch up to everybody. It wasn't fun at all. And it made the wizards feel really weak. So when we added in mobile casting, it made the game way more dynamic, and it made wizard or arcane classes much, much more fun. But it's still a trade-off, right? Like if you hold still and you're casting a beneficial spell, like something that targets yourself or an ally, or maybe a part of the map, you don't even have to roll. It's an automatic success if you hold still. So if you move and do it, there's a chance of failure. If you are casting on someone who doesn't want the spell to be on them, like an offensive spell, you have to roll for it. If you move, cast, and do it, there's an increased chance of failure. So that, just to contextualize that. But it's important to note it's something cool that any class can use mobile casting, but obviously arcane classes use it the most. And spell casting in the other classes is a little bit more limited, although there are classes that do. For example, none of the martial classes in the core box can cast spells, but in the hero expansion, where we have some more like exotic classes. You have like the paladin and the dark knight and the warlock, and the monk to a lesser degree. They all have like magic-like abilities, so it will come up for other classes. All right, so let's dive into the skills available to the Dread Mage. So their class ability, and again, your class ability is you automatically get it. It's like the defining ability of the class. Like it always goes in your deck. Theirs is called Drain Vitality. It's really, really good, right? Like it'll be a bread and butter ability. You'll use it all the time. So it's a medium range spell that does good damage. It's 4 damage dice plus power. Again, power is like strength, your strength characteristic, although it's meant to represent not just physical strength. It could be skill, physical strength, spiritual strength, metaphysical strength, intellectual ability. You typically add it to damage and healing. So it's does good damage, but the kicker to it, the shtick that makes it really unique is when the Dread Mage does it to an opponent, if it's successful, they can either heal themselves 2 red dice, or they can heal an ally within short range of the target 2 red. Now, if they do it to themselves, they can go above their starting HP. That's called temporary HP. So they can actually go above where they began. Now, with temporary HP, it only lasts for a turn. So if they go to their next activation and they're at 19 out of 16 HP, they drop back down to 16. But if they were at 19 and they were dropped down to 15, it wouldn't go down again. It's just if you're above max, it goes back to max. So it's a really cool, unique ability. So you do damage and you can heal a nearby ally. Not like a huge heal, but still it's like a secondary healing ability. Or you can heal yourself and even give yourself a boost. So it's really versatile. And you can upgrade it with feats to do more damage and more healing, which we'll get to in a bit. So it can scale up as you go through the game to become really quite powerful. And as an example of another way that's very limited to get temporary HP, but as an example of a way to do that, once you build the merchant stall at your siege camp, so in the campaign, you're building up a base as you go. You start out with nothing. You have to select which buildings you want to build. They all give you benefits. Some of them have upkeep costs and such. And figuring out the correct build order for your siege camp is going to be a really important part of navigating the campaign. Once you build the merchant stall allows you to buy items from the merchant deck, and you can get an item called the Potion of Natural Vitality. This is like a healing potion, but it can give you temporary HP. So if you only took a little bit of damage, you can drink it, and if you overheal, you didn't waste any HP. Or you can proactively use it, like for example, give it to Ajax, have him slug it, give himself a bunch of temporary HP, and then run into a bunch of monsters because you know he's going to get hit, take damage, and then it's like proactive healing. It's very cool. So the merchant stall lets you buy a bunch of different items like that. All of the merchant stall items are like one-time use. So as soon as you use it, you take the card and put it back into the merchant deck. It also lets you sell unused treasure to the merchant for extra gold. And it generates 1 gold per turn of passive income. So it's a really, really useful building. It's one that typically gets built early on in the campaign. So the primary skill tree of the Dread Mage is crowd control. Again, crowd control is very, very strong. That's why it's really limited. In any specific faction, there's only going to be there'll be one class that has a lot of crowd control abilities, and then there'll be like a little bit here and there. For example, the fighter has taunt, which can make people attack him. The ranger has a once per game ability to pin you down with a shot, so he shoots you, does damage, and then you can't move. But it's very limited because it is so strong, especially in PvP. It can be not fun if you're just getting, if you're not able to move models where you want to. And another key point about crowd control abilities is they very frequently target will, and will is often the lowest defense of a monster or a hero. The exception to this is arcane classes. Usually will is their highest defense, and then they have lower evasion and fortitude. So very frequently, if you're casting these spells on the right target, you have an extremely high probability of them going off, which is one of the reasons why they're so strong. So at level 1, the Dread Mage gets Instill Fear. It's a medium range spell, puts the fear status on the target. What does fear do, you ask? Fear is extremely powerful. A model that has fear on them cannot end a move within short range of the model that gave them fear. So, for example, if the Dread Mage puts fear on a Butcher of Ruin, which is a really big, scary monster, that Butcher can't end within short range of the Dread Mage. It's crazy strong. So once you start using it, you'll start seeing all the different tricks you can do, right? Like, you can have other heroes stand next to the Dread Mage and within their little bubble, and then the monsters can't get any of them. You can cast it and then move the Dread Mage forward, and now the monster has to go around you. You can cast it, like in PvP, you can cast it on a hero and then move your Dread Mage up to an objective, and that hero can't go get the objective. It's really, really strong. So in order to balance it out, the fear status effect can only be applied to the same model once per game from the same source. Meaning, if the Dread Mage fears a goblin once, it cannot fear that specific goblin again for the rest of the game. And we did this because in playtesting, clever players would fear somebody that was kind of in a position where they didn't have a lot of places to move, and then just go walk right next to them so they couldn't move anywhere, right? And then they would just do it every turn, and it wasn't that fun. So we put that limitation on it just to make it balanced. Also at level 1, the Dread Mage gets access to a really, really useful spell called Glimpse of the Void. This is a medium range spell that does 2 red damage. So that does a decent amount of raw damage. Again, the red dice ignore armor and they can't be blocked or parried. And a cool combo that people come up with. You give them a wand, and then you can start plinking away at even high armor targets. Hit them with Glimpse of the Void, hit them with the wand. And 4 red dice, that's starting to add up. You do it over time, you can plink away at even very high armor targets. However, what makes Glimpse of the Void really good is that it moves the target a 2 movement point movement. That's 2 in a line or 1 diagonal squares. So the amount of things you can use this for is crazy. It's like a long range version of Ranger's Kick. You can move a monster out of engagement with an ally, free somebody up. You can move a monster into engagement with an ally, with like a melee character that you want him to smash him. You can move a monster out of line of sight, so it has to move to see you. You can move a monster into line of sight of somebody else. You can move somebody off of an objective. Really, all the push abilities are crazy good. So, Glimpse of the Void is one I find that you'll use frequently. Just the ability to move models is just so strong. Level 2, the Dread Mage gets one of their premier abilities. It's called Paralyze. And as you would imagine, Paralyze basically just takes a turn away from the target. They can't do anything. When they activate, they just deactivate. It's ludicrously strong. One of the best abilities in the game. And because Paralyze is so strong, it is always a once per game ability. And a team, a faction can usually only has access to one of these so that you don't spam it. It's really, really good. And then at level 6, the Dread Mage gets Terrify. And Terrify is much like Paralyze, it's always once per game ability because it's so strong. So what Terrify does is it forces the target model to turn directly away from the Dread Mage and then make one movement action as far away as they can go. So what this does, it's a lot of things. Like for one, it moves a monster or an enemy away from you, right? So in PvP, if someone's on an objective, you can push them off the objective. In PvE or PvP, if there's a big scary monster that's on you or on a friend, you make them get off and to run away so that they can't hit you anymore. Anytime you try to cast a spell and you're being engaged, it triggers free attacks. So you don't want to have magic users engaged. You can't use ranged weapons when you're being engaged. So if like a big scary monster's on your ranger, you can terrify him, make him run away. You can make him move, out of line of sight, all kinds of, again, all the movement tricks I already mentioned. But what it also does is it makes them face away from you. So this does a couple things. When that model activates, it's going to usually have to burn an action to turn around so that it has line of sight so it can do anything at all. So it's also like a quasi stun. And in Bloodthrone, if you can attack someone in the rear arc, it's brutal. Like maneuver is a huge part of the game. If you forced a monster or an enemy hero to turn away from you, and the rest of your team can just go attack them in the back, so you get +1 advantage when you do that. And they can't dodge, they can't, block, parry, or anything. So oftentimes it means that if there's a bunch of enemies in your rear arc, you're dead. You have to be very, very mindful of not letting people flank you, which is true to real combat in real life. So the secondary skill tree for the Dread Mage is tanking or defensive abilities. So this is what makes the Dread Mage like surprisingly resilient for a magic user. Magic users usually are really, really squishy, and the Dread Mage can be they can basically be like an off tank if you want them to. So Dread Armor is a level 1 spell. It's a spell that you're going to use like almost every game. It's really good. If you build your Dread Mage to be at maximum range, maybe you take a familiar to give you even more range. A familiar you can have within basically 2 squares of the Dread Mage. You can cast spells from it. Really good. You can do it from behind a wall and all kinds of stuff. They're really fun. So if you're playing a maximum range Dread Mage, you may not use this, but if you're playing a Dread Mage that's going to be getting anywhere near the enemy, this is a really good spell. It gives you the Armored Blessing. Again, a blessing is a buff that lasts all game unless it's removed. And the Armored status effect gives you +1 damage resistance. So anytime you take damage, you remove 1 die from the damage pool, unless it's red dice. So it's really, really good. So what I often do with my Dread Mage, the way that Tatiana, the Dread Mage in the box is built, she comes with light armor. And I forgot to mention this. Wizards can only take up to light armor usually, except the priest, medium. So you get light armor, and then you put Dread armor on yourself, and you're at armor 2. Armor 2 is really good. It makes you have as much armor as the barbarian at that point. So that combined with the fact that whenever you use Drain Vitality, you're healing yourself if you want, or even giving yourself temporary HP. And then there's some other combos that I'll get to as we go. It can make the Dread Mage like surprisingly resilient for a wizard. You can actually even go into melee. You don't want to go ham, but you can selectively get yourself into melee, and there's some fun tricks which I'll cover in a bit. But at level 6, you can increase Dread Armor with a feat to become Reactive Dread Armor. And what this does is every time you're hit in melee, or when you're hit with a melee attack, the model that hit you takes 2 red damage automatically. So clearly really, really good, right? So a fun trick is you can walk the Dread Mage with Dread Armor and the Reactive Dread Armor upgrade into like a group of like chaff monsters, like goblins, and they'll all start attacking you. You're not taking much damage because you have armor, you have damage reduction too, but they're like killing themselves as they hit you. So it's one of the ways that the Dread Mage can be like sneaky good, and it takes some repetitions to kind of discover some of these combos. At level 4, you get one of my favorite spells of all of the abilities in the core game. It's called Pain Link. Pain Link is a curse, so it's a game-long debuff. It can be removed with special abilities, but if it's not, it lasts the whole game. So you put it on an enemy, and every time the Dread Mage gets hit, anywhere on the table, the model that's Pain Linked, it takes 2 red dice of damage. And then you can upgrade it at level 6 with Greater Pain Link to do 3 red dice of damage, which is starting to get pretty gnarly. So again, much like with Dread Armor, a trick that you can do is buff yourself, Pain Link a really scary big monster, run into a bunch of enemies that are going to attack you, let them hit you, and you're not going to take too much damage. But then the really tough monster is just getting plink, 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 plink. You can just throw buckets of red dice at them, and then often over the course of a couple of turns, you'll kill them without ever even hitting them. It's glorious. It's really fun, and it's just, again, it's one of the reasons why I love the Dread Mage class. They're so versatile. And then the ultimate ability for the Dread Mage is crazy. All the ultimate abilities are crazy, but this one is particularly crazy, especially in PvP. In PvP, it's like the trap card from Yu-Gi-Oh! So this card is played when the Dread Mage would be knocked out. So then, before you remove the model, you get a free casting action. You cast this on any enemy model in range and in line of sight. And if it's successful, you successfully cast it and it's not denied or resisted, that model dies instead and you stay alive with 1 HP. It's ridiculous. It doesn't always come into play, and obviously you don't want to get knocked out, but it's one of those, like, when you have that in your back pocket, it's insane. And in PvP specifically, your opponent's going to be like, oh gosh, like, you'll play mind games with them because they'll try and attack you where you can't see anybody else or block your line of sight and then do it. And in PvE, if you can take out like a boss monster with it, it's pretty epic. The tertiary skill tree for the Dread Mage, there's only one. It's range DPS, and their primary ability, Drain Vitality, also falls under this category. This spell it's a once per game. It's a doozy. It's level 8. It's called Vitality Vortex. Once per game, you hit everyone in range and line of sight with Drain Vitality. So I don't think I really need to explain how insane this can get. If you have like 3 targets that you can hit and you get them all, not only do you do a ton of damage, but all of a sudden the Dread Mage gets HP from each one of those targets. It's crazy strong. You can put yourself up to like 50 temporary HP if you were to optimize it. So really fun ability, and it can absolutely change the game if you do it correctly. So for class feats, again, there's general feats that get level 1, 3, 7. They're available to everybody. And then you have class specific feats at 2, 4, 6, 8. And with feats, you always can only take one of the options. And then at level 5 and 9, you get a stat boost point. You can increase like your intelligence, your power, or whatever. Stat can only ever be boosted once, though. So arcane classes are a little different than whereas with martial classes, it's pretty straightforward. It's like increase offense or increase defense, or increase range offense or increase melee offense, or whatever. It's usually just pretty straightforward. With arcane class, it's a little bit more nuanced. It's usually like increase the power of one of your existing spells, or get a general increase, or have some sort of a thematic ability. And what this does, and the reason why, is because arcane classes are always casting spells, right? So it simultaneously shoehorns the decision abilities and opens up the doors to doing all kinds of creative stuff. So you have a lot of room to like make your favorite spell go super ham, or just become better all around, or do some weird goofy thing that only that one wizard can do. It's fun. It lets you you can really customize your arcane classes. So at level 2, you can either take Unnatural Vitality, which lets you use the Drain Vitality class ability to give temporary HP to allies. So if you zapped a monster and then you had Kidra the Barbarian next to it, you could send the HP to her and then go above her starting HP. It's really useful. Or you can get +1 range, +1 square range on your spells. So for someone that's new, +1 square probably doesn't sound super exciting. You're like, why would I ever take that? So the reason that we have these kinds of abilities in the game is that denial abilities, so classes that can stop you from using your special abilities, their range is pretty much always medium range, right? Medium range and line of sight, just like almost all offensive spells are medium range and line of sight. So if you can cast your spell from 1 square outside of the range of a monster or opposing hero that does denial, they can't deny you. So that +1 square can be the difference between getting your spell off and not. So it depends on how you build your Dread Mage. Like if you build your Dread Mage to go in, get in the mix, and be fighting up close, that won't come up because you're always going to be within range to be denied anyway. But if you're playing a long bomb downtown Johnny Brown style Dread Mage that's using abilities from as far away as possible, that +1 square is amazingly good. At level 4, you can take Life Siphon, which does +1 red die damage to Drain Vitality and +1 red die of healing. So it starts out doing 2 red die of healing, it would go up to 3. And then it would do 4 damage dice plus power +1 red. Very good, right? Now 3 red dice of healing, that's starting to get very, very strong for healing. Or you can instead just take +1 metaphysics, which makes all your spells better and makes your wand more accurate if you took a wand. Level 6, you can take Greater Pain Link or Reactive Dread Armor, which I already covered. Basically, whichever of those 2 spells you use more, like more, you can make them better. Straightforward. At level 8, you can take Life Stealer, which is the exact same thing as Life Siphon. +1 red die of damage, +1 red die of healing, and yes, it does stack. So if you took both, by the time you get to level 8, you're doing 4 damage dice plus power plus 2 red dice of damage, and you'd be doing 4 red dice of healing, which is a lot. That's like the Priest's healing spell, which is the best healing spell in the game, but of course they can make theirs better as well. Really, really good. Right, so if you want to do a DPS style Dread Mage, you stack those and you're just blasting people. Or at level 8, and this is one of those kind of like wacky, fun, thematic ones that's really good, you can take Revenge Beyond Death. What that does is anytime a friendly model within medium range of the Dread Mage gets knocked out, the model that knocked them out automatically takes 3 red dice of damage, which these automatic damage abilities are actually pretty rare. The Dread Mage just happens to have a lot of them. Because we felt like it worked with their ability to manipulate life essence and life force, control the void. So again, if you're playing a long-range Dread Mage, Life Stealer, definitely the better choice. If you're playing a Dread Mage that's going to be up in the mix with their crew, Revenge Beyond Death can get you a lot of HP. Especially if you have a bunch of summons in play and they're getting popped. You could start throwing red dice all over the place, and it's automatic. You don't have to roll, right? So, fun ability. Definitely some good options there. So Tatiana is built pretty specifically to have extremely high offensive stats and to be able to take damage, right? So we'll go through it just to break it down. First of all, she has an insane metaphysics of 6. That's almost the highest you can get it at level 1. So just as a quick refresher, whenever you're performing an action which requires an action roll, which is usually when you're acting upon a model that does not want you to do whatever it is, like you're shooting a spell at them or you're trying to hit them, trying to disarm the trap on a chest, etc., it requires an action roll. And the way that works is you take your offensive modifier, which, as you can see on the hero board in front of you, those are the white squares. Those are offensive modifiers, and then you go against a specific defensive modifier, which are the blue ones. And damage reductions is you don't target damage reduction just in case to avoid any confusion. That's how much damage reduction, how many dice you take away when you take damage. So when you have an action or an offensive modifier of 6, it's almost always going to be higher than the defensive stat. So when you're rolling the dice, you take the action dice, and then you take the difference between the offensive and defensive modifier. If you have more white dice, each one of those increases your odds of hitting and getting a critical. If you have more defensive dice, the blue, that increases your odds of getting a critical failure, and it lowers your odds of hitting. So because she's so high, if you go back and look at the defensive stats of some of the martial characters, crowd control abilities usually target will. Most of the monsters and martial care, like any offensively oriented hero or monster, their will's gonna be like 1 or 2. So she's gonna be so much higher than them that it's gonna be very, very rare for her to fail. Now, her offensive spells usually target fortitude, the ones that do damage. And again, like against like wizards and skill-based classes, they usually have low fortitude. But even the warriors, their fortitude is usually lower than their evasion. So she, with her high metaphysics of 6, she's going to be very, very consistently getting her spells off. And that's one of the things that makes the arcane classes good, is that usually they have a variety of spells that attack a variety of different defenses, so you can pick and choose what's the most advantageous for your current situation. It's one of the reasons that I think that the arcane classes are so fun to play. So she also has a very respectable power of 2. Again, you typically add power to damage or healing. Not always, but frequently you do. So she's going to be throwing a good amount of dice when she's doing damage, especially with Drain Vitality. She has light armor, so she can do a lot of the tricks I described earlier, where she can give herself dread armor to go up to armor 2, reactive dread armor, et cetera, et cetera. She can be pretty durable. She also has a pretty surprising amount of HP. She has 16 HP, which, I mean, that's the same as the Grey Wolf the Ranger, and it's higher than Dallin and the Rogue, and they're martial characters. Martial characters start out with more HP than arcane classes do. So Tatiana has a constitution of 2, which means that every odd level 3, 5, 7, 9, everyone gets 1 HP plus their constitution and any other modifiers. So at level 3, she goes up to 19, and at level 5, she goes up to 22, 25, etc. Mid-game, she's got more HP than like, there's only a couple characters that have more HP than she does. And this is why the Dread Mage starts to become like almost like an off tank. Like she's got her arcane staff, which can let her parry if she needs to, and she's can drain the life out of people. It makes her really surprisingly tough. Now, level 1, 16 HP is not going to. I wouldn't recommend running and trying to face tank, a tough monster. But selectively putting her into combat, especially with kind of the weaker monsters, she can totally hold her own and tank the damage. Obviously she's not meant to be a melee character, but she's an arcane class that can get in there and not like, oh my, I'm totally, boned. So now the downside to all of this great stuff is that she has evasion 1, which is basically, you can get to 0, but it's pretty uncommon. So evasion 1 means that she's really vulnerable to physical attacks. Anybody that attacks her, with a normal weapon is probably going to hit her. And much like Kijo, the Barbarian, she's built to take a hit, not to avoid a hit. So keep that in mind. Like, she's not invulnerable by any stretch of the imagination. She's able to take a couple punches before she goes down. And then later in the game, especially if you give her some like magic items that increase her HP or give her some more damage reduction, she can become, fairly tanky, but just keep that in mind. She also has a really, really good class skill of 4. That means she can take up to 4 cards. So at level 1, she'll take all of her class skills plus 1 extra general skill. As a quick refresher, you always get your class ability. You also get your heritage ability, it's like your racial. You always get 1 general skill and 1 class skill on top of, you get 1 base, right? So her 4 is the 1 plus 3 bonuses. So she starts out with a lot of cards, and that's one of the reasons why the arcane classes can feel a little intimidating, because they have more cards to begin than like the martial classes. But what this means is as you level up, you can find more ways to get more class skills in your deck. If you want to, if you build her this way, you can end the game with basically her whole, like all the cards in her deck, if you want, and then she has a ton of options. Whereas martial characters, like, for example, Dallin has 2 class skills, so does Kijo. They might end the game at 2 class skills. Like, they only ever get 2, even though they get more options. If you wanted to, you could build like Tatiana to have all of them, right? Like, there's ways to do that. So it gives you a tremendous amount of flexibility. It does require you to actually read what the cards do so that you can use them intelligently. But that's one of the reasons why I think the Dread Mage is the highest skill cap class in the game, because not only do they have a lot of abilities, they can use them, and there's creative ways to use said abilities. So it's one of those classes that you feel like you keep finding ways to do new things with them, which I find to be a lot of fun. So it can be a little intimidating for a new player. If you have someone who's brand new, who's a casual gamer, or just new to Bloodthrone, if they're the kind of if they're a gamer, sure, but if they're pretty casual, maybe not the best class to start with. So some tips to using her. The crowd control. A lot of people who are new try to do damage with the Dread Mage, and they're like just trying to plink away. The crowd control is the bread and butter of what they do. That when you're in your mind, when you're prioritizing what your action, your order of operations should be, think, can I use crowd control first and then damage second, right? That's how you get the most mileage out of her. One of the best things you can do, like say you're playing PvE and you have a monster like the Berserker coming at you, who's insane melee monster, can kill pretty much anybody. Like Ajax is the only hero that can take the Berserker and not just get smoked. A really good trick is to let the Berserker get close and have Tatiana paralyze him. And then you can either ignore him, you get one turn to ignore him and run away and go give objectives, or you can dogpile him with your whole team, or hit him with Terrify. And then the next turn, hit him with Paralyze. And then the next turn, hit him with Fear. Oh, I think he's immune to Fear. I'll have to double check that. I think he has immunity to Fear, but those are the ways you get the most mileage out of the Dread Mage, right? If you're in PvP and you've got you got your opponent's most powerful DPS character barreling down on you, do the same thing, right? So it takes the pressure off. It gives you a turn to do what to not let your opponent do what they want, to let you do what you want, right? And then all the other tricksy stuff, that's kind of that's like the icing on the cake. But the cake is the crowd control abilities. I can't tell you how many times in playtesting I saw people try to use her as basically like the ranger to just sit back and shoot, which it's not terrible. It's just you're ignoring her best abilities when you do that. Also, as a Revenant, she has a heritage ability called Cold Touch of Death. Once per game, all heritage abilities once per game. She can try to stun someone within reach range. It's to reflect the aura that Revenants put off of like unease. And in Bloodthrone, Revenants they're undead. They're not like zombies. They're not like rotting and eating flesh. They look normal, except they have like a deathly pale pallor, and they have an aura of unease, like something's not right. And in the lore, the faction she's from, like everyone's stuck in various forms of this state. Basically, their deva is what we call it, like their god of their realm, made like this horrible sacrifice and basically didn't let any of these individuals' soul leave their body, right? So they can't, they're dead. They don't sleep. They don't eat. Their senses, their experience of life is weird. It's largely unpleasant. They can't reproduce, and they have to consume Devithae, and Devithae again is like stolen soul essence. So they're like unwilling soul vampires. The lore is awesome for it. I won't go too deep into it, but they're desperately trying to find a cure for their own condition. So they're, kind of thinking like The Crow, for example, the movie. It's kind of on track with it, with what a Revenant is. So at any rate, really good ability. Once per game, you can try and stun someone. It's great. When you're making your own Dread Mage, you want to ask yourself the question, do I want to get up in the mix, or do I want to stay back and plink away at range? You stay back, you can maximize your offensive stats and totally neglect your defensive stats. Like, who cares if you don't have barely any HP and you're easy to hit? If you're far away, and you're using your abilities at maximum damage, you may not get hit at all. And then your ability to do what you want to do and do it to maximum effect is very high. Doing a lot of damage, very accurate with your spells. Or if you want a more flexible Dread Mage, which is my preferred way to do it, kind of spread the stats around, or like Tatiana, where it's like you sacrifice your evasion, but you have lots of HP, you can take a hit, you're still really good at casting spells. if you go that way, you have more flexibility in what you do with it. I'm not saying either one's better or worse, just depends on the way you like to play. And that's what you want to think of when you're building them, right? And that's going to dictate what equipment you take, how you're going to, what beginning feats you're going to choose, all this sort of thing. And you can get a Dread Mage to be however you want it, right? You have a lot of flexibility in how you play it and how you want to assign your stat points. When you're playing against them, obviously the thing you want to be the most prepared for is their crowd control abilities. Excuse me. So a really good counter to the Dread Mage is like an Inquisitor or anyone that can stop spells. Obviously, that's going to be the best against any magic user. But the Ranger is really good for taking out pretty much any arcane class because you can do it long range, high damage. The Rogue is really good at it too. You just want to find a way to get up, engage with the Dread Mage without being, stun locked, terrified, whatever the case may be. And if you can get on them, you want to be able to just blender them as quickly as possible. So the main thing is just to be mindful of the crowd control abilities, because if you're sending your number one hero, hell bent for leather up the table, and then they spend 2 turns not doing what you want them to do, the game might be over at that point. And then obviously when you're playing with the Dread Mage in PvP, you want to be able to use those abilities without getting stopped by your opponent's counter abilities or things that block line of sight, like a smoke bomb. The Druid can make the earth or vines grow up to block line of sight. Things like that can really throw a monkey wrench into your plan, so you want to be mindful of that. So, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. We had to cover a lot of ground on just kind of the arcane classes in general, but hopefully you found it informative. If you want to back Bloodthorn, you still can over at GameFound. And if you have a request for the next class to cover, please just let me know. It was fun to do this for Andre M as requested, so happy to take any requests for the next one. Thank you so much. Hope you have a great day.